The Exodus ship of 1947 may be unknown to many, but this small ship of refugees soon became an international scandal centred around the British response to the situation. This marked a turning point in British relations in the Mandate of Palestine, eventually leading to the creation of the Israel state in May 1948. Britain was in charge of immigration for Palestine from 1920 because of its mandate given by the League of Nations. This was because British troops were already in the area after the First World War. Initially, immigration was set to 60,000 annually in 1935. However, as more people began to come into this brewing pot of Palestine, tensions came to a head, which led to a revolt and the White Paper in 1939 under Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. This capped immigration at 75,000 over the next 5 years. But as Hitler's regime continued to persecute the Jews, more and more illegal attempts were made to access Palestine, until on the 13th of November 1945, the new Foreign Minister, Bevin, capped immigration at just 1,500 per month.
The journey embarked on by the brave Jewish men, women and children aboard the 3 British troop ships was a tumultuous one, ending in disappointment. At the beginning of what was to become a long journey, the original ship, intended to reach Palestine, embarked on the 11th of July 1947, carrying 4,500 Jewish passengers, all displaced survivors of the Holocaust. On the 18th of July, before the ship even made it to Palestinian waters, British destroyers surrounded the vessel. A struggle ensued in which 3 people died, 1 Jewish crew member and 2 passengers. The British wanted to use their captured refugees as somewhat of a deterrent. Subsequently, after abandoning the original SS President Warfield ship in the port of Haifa, now Israel, the Jewish people aboard were sailed to Port de Boux in France, where they were ordered to leave the ship. French authorities refused to step in when the prisoners would not disembark, while the British were afraid of potentially bad media rep back home should they force the prisoners off of the ship. A stalemate ensued where a 24-hour hunger strike occurred in retaliation to the poor treatment the refugees were forced to endure, which thus far had been described as a floating Auschwitz. Certainly, this kind of treatment was not befitting of any human life, least of all those who had just been saved from the horrors of real-life concentration camps. 3 weeks after arriving at Port de Boux, the British authorities came to the decision that prisoners would be taken to British-occupied Hamburg on the 22nd of August, where they were interned at transit camps after they arrived on the 8th of September. This decision was met with disappointment among Jewish people aboard who had just managed to escape Germany and its occupied nations. Across Europe, displaced persons in European transit camps protested and staged their own hunger strikes when they heard the news. Swathes of public demand brought forth immense public embarrassment for Britain and played a huge role in the swing of sympathy towards the Jews and eventually in the Jewish recognition of a state in 1948.
So conditions on board the President Warfield, otherwise known as the Exodus, were considered better than what they were on the 3 British vessels. According to British Captain A.C. Barclay, he described them as adequate in comparison to the poor conditions that they had on board the British ones. For example, there was less space, but they were better supplied, better protected from the elements, and overall they were a lot happier. This led to tensions on board between British sailors and Jewish immigrants due to the fact that the British sailors as well had better conditions and also more recreation time, alongside the ability to leave the vessel for breaks if needed. This obviously led to the hunger strikes that we've already mentioned and also the description of a floating Auschwitz. For the Jewish people on board, food and medical supplies were often out of date, sometimes even rotten, described as maggots and flies being found in food supplies that had already gone out during the war. It created the perfect conditions for a storm on board the British vessels. The voyage resulted in other issues, hunger strikes. More extreme methods of protest became commonplace as well, leading to violence amongst sailors and their passengers. People who wanted to leave as well couldn't leave due to the fact that baggage was lost, personal items were also disappearing between passengers. This led to more tensions, and it led to even further issues for Captain A.C. Barclay, who had to beg the French mayor of Marseille at the time for more food and supplies, claiming that they were basically reliant on the charity of the French to keep supplied and keep the ship running. Overall, this creates an atmosphere of fear and desperation amongst both British and Jewish sailors at the time.
One of the most significant primary sources on this topic was the hunger strike letter addressed to the captain of the Runnymede Park, attributed to all those on board. This demonstrated one form of resistance undertaken by the refugees, a hunger strike starting at 8 o'clock on the 18th of August, declaring they would, quote, not get off in France, end quote, and would, quote, give you the assurance that we will keep to our decision. The refugees outlined their frustrations, protesting against, quote, the inadmissible attitude against the remarks of our Jewish people, which for years have been slaughtered by Hitler Germany, and demand our immediate departure. In the final line, they write, open up for us the gates of our homeland and entry to Israel, Palestine. While the primary source of the hunger strike letter gives us an insight into the resistance of the Jewish people on board some of these ships, some other primary sources we looked at also give us an insight into this story. Significantly were the newspapers. Now, although it was reported all over the globe, it most affected France and Britain for obvious reasons, and so you saw most of the stories in British and French media. But they presented sort of different, different ideas. On one hand, the British press offered a more objective view, including arguments from Dennis Pritt on the side of the refugees and Sir Frank Soskis, the Crown. Pritt argued that people were being illegally detained, that Palestine was established as a legal home. He argued that the decision to send these people was a political blunder. But ultimately the state won and Soskis was successful. Nevertheless, the British did report their sort of violence on the British side, specifically the events in September in Hamburg, which saw steel-helmeted troops turn hosepipes on the 1,300 on the Runnymede Park. Reports noted, quote, the sound of splintering wood and constant screaming, end quote, and a man carried down the gangway with head wounds in a scene of violence. However, they did include reports of British soldiers being injured under a paragraph in bold and capitalised font that read, quote, troops hurt at Hamburg, end quote. The French media presented a more partisan tone, appearing to outrightly support the refugees, placing more emphasis on the individuals on board and their experience than the British. For example, one article focused on the poor conditions of the Empire rival, which saw overcrowded conditions by Jews that just wanted to return home. The French reported that the refugees made banners reading, "The descendants of Nelson are pirates, and like France, we want liberty, equality, fraternity." In terms of government intervention, it was outlined that the French were prepared to help, as promised by Mr. Runnymede, the Council of Ministers President. One paper from August the 1st described the conditions, reporting that for the other unfortunate passengers on the scorching metal deck or in the hot holds under an implacable sun, they are waiting for a satisfactory and humane solution.
Clement Attlee was the British Prime Minister at the time of the Exodus's voyage. He was the first Prime Minister following the end of the Second World War. Thus, he was tasked with overseeing the recovery of Britain, Europe, and the overseas British territories. Attlee's approach to stopping the migration of displaced Jewish people following the end of the war attracted staunch criticism globally, most notably from the Truman administration, the Conservative Party of Great Britain, and most prominently from Zionist groups both in Europe and America. Attlee's policies would take him as far as sabotaging 5 refugee ships with the help of MI6. He would even create a fake Palestinian group to take responsibility for the sabotage. The Navy also captured 50,000 refugees en route to Palestine, detaining them in Cyprus until the State of Israel had been established in 1948. His pro-Arab stance may have stemmed from several reasons. He was a Labour Prime Minister, and the Labour Party was generally less Zionist than the Conservative opposition. However, it's also important to note that the Labour Party also had a history of anti-Semitism, which could have influenced his opinion on Jewish immigration. Attlee's military career had also put him closer in alignment to the Colonial Office than the Foreign Office. This was significant as the Colonial Office generally held a more pro-Arab stance, as it had made promises on behalf of Britain following the First World War of a pan-Arab state in return for military aid against the Ottoman Empire. This was crucial in the war effort, and later inspired works like Lawrence of Arabia. In contrast, the Foreign Office held a more pro-Zionist stance. They saw Zionism as a potential solution to the displacement of European Jews following the end of World War II, and they realised an Israeli state could also be a major ally in the Middle East in years to come. By 1947, British Palestine became increasingly expensive to maintain, and the developing conflict in the region between Zionists arriving from Europe and the local Palestinian population meant that the region was growing increasingly unstable. A combination of these factors and the criticism directed at Britain for their handling of the situation led Britain to hand the issue over to the UN, a decision largely supported by the British public, subsequently resulting in the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948.
The story of the Exodus 1947 is a poignant tale of resilience, determination and tragedy. Despite being a story of both immense bravery, it is sadly often still unknown to the wider public. As a group, we've been honoured to retell this story of the 4,515 Jewish men, women and children who went to unbelievable lengths simply to flee persecution and start a new life, far away from the tragedies that unfolded in Europe during the war. Despite being under threat the entire journey, the Jewish refugees aboard the Exodus 1947 never gave up or lost sight of their goal. The unwavering resilience of the Jewish migrants on board, in spite of the countless obstacles and adversity they face, serves as an inspiration to people today all around the world facing persecution. The Exodus has become a powerful symbol of the indomitable spirit and unwavering determination of the Jewish people, who, despite facing seemingly insurmountable hurdles, refuse to give up on their dreams of a better life for themselves and their future generations. The Exodus 1947 was truly a multifaceted event and was influenced not only by the desire of the desperate Jewish migrants, but also by the complex, ever-changing international policies and affairs of the time. The events surrounding the Exodus 1947 served as a wake-up call to the international community, revealing the true extent of the persecution and discrimination that the Jewish refugees faced in the post-war Europe. Despite the valiant effort of those on board the ship, their goal was unsuccessful. However, their efforts undoubtedly generated support and sympathy for the Zionist movement and could be argued as a catalyst to the invention of the Israel state.